That's so brilliant! This video is sponsored by Case Filters. Forget everything you've heard about the exposure triangle. It's holding you back from getting really great photos. In this video I will show you what you should do instead. Hi my friends, very nice to see you. The exposure triangle. 9 of 10 photographers have learned that in a totally wrong way, and that's the reason why they struggle with their photography for months or even some years in some cases. And the crazy thing is that for most photographers that comes that point where they get it through, but then they explain it in a totally exactly wrong way as they have learned it. So what's the problem with the exposure triangle? And therefore I would say let's make a quick explanation of the exposure triangle. That's an important point, don't overjump it. We need this common explanation to find out what's going wrong actually. And this is the explanation. The exposure triangle describes the relationship between aperture, shutter speed and ISO, which controls the amount of light that goes on the sensor. If one of these elements gets changed, you have to compensate one of the other elements for getting the same exposure level. So if you open the aperture by 1 stop, for instance, you will need to compensate this by either halving the shutter speed or by halving the ISO to get the same exposure level and the same amount of light on your sensor. And yeah, that's an explanation most photographers would give to a beginner, right? And I mean, just technically spoken, that's totally right, of course. But now here comes the dilemma. Let's say you increase the aperture for 1 stop and you decrease the shutter speed for 1 stop to compensate. That will lead to the same exposure level through, but the final image will anyway look different. I know this, you might know this when you are an experienced photographer, but for a beginner, this is the point where it starts to get confusing because it is too much of information in short time. So my tip here is forget the exposure triangle. Because what I always see again on my workshops is that photographers are choosing the wrong camera settings just because they try to consider the exposure triangle. I think the main problem is actually that it is called exposure triangle, but it is not only all about the exposure. An important part of the exposure triangle is that each of these 3 components, aperture, shutter speed and ISO, leads to a different style, and this is the important thing. The style. I'm not talking about the personal style of a photographer, that's also super important, of course. There are so many mistakes done, and I made already a video about that, I will link it up here for you. I'm more talking about the style given by your camera settings. So what pros do is they simply don't focus on the exposure triangle. Forget the exposure triangle. I would recommend to use more something like a stylistic triangle or a triangle of styles or something like that. Because the part of compensating the exposure level is important though, but just for getting the right exposure, not for getting a great photograph. The most important thing is to find the right style with your camera settings. Just quickly for beginners, the aperture controls the depth of field, which means how thick is the focusing layer, and the shutter speed controls the amount of motion blur, and the ISO controls how grainy the image will get. Yeah, also the ISO can be seen as a stylistic instrument. So we have a triangle of 3 different styles: depth of field, motion blur and grain. The triangle of styles is also much easier because we don't have to compensate here for anything. We just define the aperture we want to use, we define the shutter speed we want to use and the ISO just in point of view of style. That's it. We don't think about exposure, not at this point. How simple is that? Now, the only problem we get when we work like that is that we will run into problems with the exposure, of course. But in the first step, I would anyway ignore the exposure, focus on the style. And when you're clear about that, engage with the exposure. We simply uncouple the style part from the exposure bar. And in my experience, that's much easier to understand for beginners. I tried this on my workshops, and since I explained it like that, it changed everything for them. So first we focus on the style, and then we focus on the exposure. And that's quite simple. The only thing you have to do is you have to find out which of these three components are important for the style of your image: aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. In my landscape photography, in nearly every single case, the aperture is the most important thing, because I simply want to define how much of my image gets sharp. This is why I nearly always use aperture priority on my camera. And the crazy thing now is when I do that, my camera is handling the exposure triangle for me. I just define the aperture I want to use, I define the ISO to the base ISO of my camera, ISO 100 for instance, and the camera compensates the right shutter speed for me. I made already a comprehensive video where I show everything in detail, which camera settings I use in which situation, also how I bring aperture and shutter speed together when I want to show motion in my landscape scenes, for instance. I will link you a video here for you to watch next. My friends, I hope you liked this video of yours. Please give me a thumb up. Don't forget to tune in next week, there will come a fantastic video as well. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.